You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Cynthia Hill, director of Burden of Proof, and Stephen Pandos, brother of Jennifer Pandos, here to talk about the HBO Max series, Burden of Proof. Cynthia and Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's go ahead and get some introductory material here out of the way before we talk about your series, Burden of Proof. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourselves? Cynthia, we'll start with you, and then Stephen, I'll have you jump in.
Okay.
I'm a filmmaker based in Durham, North Carolina. I've been making documentaries for now 25 years. And this last project, Burden of Proof, we've been working on this one since 2015.
Or a third of your career.
Exactly. Where do I go from here is always like panic.
Oh, that's where we come in.
And Stephen, how about you?
I'm Stephen Pandos. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and work in a commercial real estate investment.
How did the two of you end up connecting to build this relationship that resulted in this wonderful product, Burden of Proof?
He sent me a LinkedIn message that said, call me.
Did he say anything else? Was there a pitch contained? Or, Stephen, what did you say?
There was not. My recollection is the only thing it said was, call me. And so I had just recently brought on board Kristin Delp, who's the producer on this project, and she had just graduated from college. And her job for the first couple of weeks was to respond to emails and clean out my voice messages and LinkedIn messages or whatever. And so she came across this one, and Kristin's the one that actually called Stephen that day.
Stephen, did you indicate that you were the brother of a missing person and wanted to talk to her about a documentary, or what did you say?
I don't recall really the specific message. It might just have been as blunt as "please call me" or something.
I think it was blunt.
And that's how it started. So it was with I don't know how long the first conversation with Kristin was, but it was a while. And she hung on and heard the story, even though Cynthia was telling her to hang up on me.
Yeah, this is a time when we were working out of my kitchen. We were in between offices, I like to say. And I could see her getting visibly emotional as she's talking with Stephen. And I didn't know what was going on. I could be some crazy person, who the heck knows. And so I was motioning for her to hang up on him. And she's shooing me away. No, it's good. It's good. And so when she hangs up, she tells me this story that Stephen just told her. And she proceeds to Google all of the information, and everything that Stephen had conveyed was there as much as we could find online. We knew he wasn't making up this story. And so we spent the next couple of hours just talking about the implications of what this kind of tragedy has on someone like Stephen and his family.
Stephen, at the point you reached out to Cynthia and Kristin, had you seen Cynthia's 2014 documentary, Private Violence? How did she move on to your radar?
No, not at the time. I got referred to Cynthia by a firm in New York, Candescent Films, and that was a result of me just picking up the phone and calling people who were in the documentary film business.
They were an executive producer on Private Violence, by the way.
Yeah, just by coincidence. And since what I was talking about was sort of along the same lines as Private Violence in terms of what I was thinking about at the time, about trauma and its the nuances and complications from it. And so they suggested I reach out to Cynthia. So I did.
Cynthia, once you heard Stephen's story, did you anticipate that this was going to be a multi-year event? How did you see this partnership unspooling?
Of course not. I keep promising myself after I conclude a project that the next one will not take as long as this last one. And I keep outdoing myself. I've decided to never make that promise again. I think that when you tackle anything like this, you have to be willing to go wherever the story takes you. And I've learned that over the years and my career. That's what really makes a good story and a good film, is if you have the patience to let it play out. And so obviously we did not know that this one would take this long. And if you had told both of us that when we first did that first shoot, that we would be filming for 7.5 years, I imagine both of us would have said no. Stephen and myself would have been like, no way, we're never going to do this. But it's just the road that we took, the path we took, and it led us to where we are now.
What did that shoot actually look like? Like, how often per week, per month, per year would you see each other? And you would show up at Stephen's house with cameras and go, okay, it's time to go to work. I'm really curious about what it looks like to shoot with someone for 7 years.
The first time we shoot, it's the first time I meet Stephen. So I had not actually spoken to him. I just was getting the information from Kristin. And from that initial conversation she had with him, we decided that it was worth pursuing and at least seeing where a couple of shoots would get it. So at least one shoot with Stephen. And so Stephen drives to Durham. At this point, I think that he's willing to do whatever it takes to try to get interest in his sister's case, and feeling like he'd hit a brick wall. So he rolls up in front of my house and we just film. We film pretty much as he's walking in the door. And we've been filming with him like that ever since. So
and those scenes are in the first episode, right?
Yep. It's the first thing with Stephen, is that first meeting, that first encounter with us. Because for me, it's really important that I capture those first conversations, because a lot of times those are the most revealing conversations. You get the most raw emotion because it's the first time that they're telling me that story. It's the first time Stephen's telling me what happened. And so I just wanted to be sure that we captured that.
Tell us a little bit about Burden of Proof then. If someone hasn't seen the documentary series yet, what is it?
Stephen, you want to tackle that one? Or you?
No, I think that's up to you. I'm a little too close. I'm in the fishbowl. I'm not the best person to ask.
I guess I can give you what we call our elevator pitch, which is, this is Burden of Proof is the story of Jennifer Pandos, a 15-year-old girl who went missing in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1987. We follow her brother as he seeks justice for his sister. So that, in a nutshell, is what this story is about.
As soon as we started receiving requests from our listeners, hey, have you guys watched Burden of Proof? Are you covering Burden of Proof? And I looked at the information about this. The first thing that I really thought was brother seeking justice for murdered sister. That sounds a lot like my partner in crime. This is so interesting.
Very familiar storyline there.
It's a very familiar storyline. And so we were hooked from minute one. Stephen, your story it's so similar to Bill's that I was sitting there watching the documentary and going, this sounds so familiar. Like, you guys have gone through a lot of the same struggles in terms of law enforcement issues. And I just want to take a minute just on a personal level and say how sorry I am that you've had to go through that. And I really feel for you in every way that I can. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. That's kind. Yeah.
One of the things that was very striking for us was there's also a contrast, and I'm not criticizing here, but I don't think there's much way around this. We were floored by how little Kristin and I knew about the Jennifer Pandos disappearance. Kristin lives in Williamsburg. She's a teacher in Williamsburg. She actually graduated from the same high school, Lafayette High School, that Jennifer was attending. And Jennifer's disappearance happens just a couple of months after the October 1986 murder of my sister Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. And one of the things that's come up with us in discussion with other people outside the four of us here is that someone made the observation that they felt like the Colonial Parkway murders, which weren't called that back then because they hadn't even all happened yet, but that the high-profile murder of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, followed by these murders of these other young people, sucked the oxygen out of the room in Williamsburg from a kind of a media perspective, which we'd never thought about, Kristin and I. We were shocked by that. One of our strongest takeaways from watching Burden of Proof is, why didn't the Pandos case receive more attention back in 1987 when Jennifer first disappeared? Stephen, do you have a sense of why that might have happened?
No. When Jennifer disappeared, I was in college in North Carolina and never really moved back to Williamsburg other than for maybe a few months after that. And dealing with law enforcement was always something that my parents did. I was, 18 at the time. That just wasn't my job.
Yeah.
That was my parents' thing to do. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that.
Cynthia, do you have any sense of why this case
Yeah.
was so low-key for so long?
We had that exact same question whenever we first started, because when you would Google Jennifer Pandos, there were only just a few mentions, and if you did some real hard digging, you could find those earlier articles or mentions about her being missing in the local paper, but that was it. For us, it was very disturbing, especially with what was going on with the Parkway murders. And Bill, I just want to say your and Stephen's stories, the way that they parallel are so uncanny.
Yeah.
And so I didn't put that together either until we got this request from y'all for this podcast. But it was something that we would talk about quite often with our team here, our internal team, as to how did this get such little attention, and why, with a 15-year-old girl missing, was there not more done? I think that it was a different time, and with kids going missing, unfortunately, they're like, okay, she ran away. And it's the time before cell phones and constant contact with people. And so I think that for the cops, at least from the questioning that I have done within the police department and the former investigators, it was like they just assumed that it was a runaway and they treated it as such. But even if that's the case, a runaway teen is in so much danger of something worse happening. Even if she did run away, that this still wasn't given the kind of attention that it should have been given is so sad.
Agreed that the times were very different, but it's actually shocking now, especially to look back in retrospect, and agreed this is a pre-cell phone, pre-social media environment. When we speak about the Colonial Parkway murders, I always feel like I'm talking about the Civil War, because we have to remind, when we speak to college audiences, for example, they will ask, why didn't somebody call on their cell phone? And how come they didn't get surveillance video? People forget that surveillance video is a relatively new thing. Except for maybe your local 7-Eleven, you didn't see cameras outside of homes and retail establishments for the most part. There's all kinds of changes. And then, of course, I think you were touching on this a little bit indirectly, which is the idea of a runaway 15-year-old girl or any young person could be in danger. We talk about sex trafficking now, which I don't remember people talking about 30 years ago.
No.
But it's actually shocking to look back and see just how little was done with Jennifer's disappearance in 1987.
Yeah. And I think for us, that was always like a big mystery. And that original case file from 1987 was missing. We didn't have a clear picture as to what did actually happen in 1987. Did they get the telephone records, or did they go to Gate and acquire the ins and outs of people coming in and out of that gated community? Like, we didn't have any idea if any of that had transpired.
Was anybody from law enforcement able to answer those questions? The original investigators didn't move to the moon. Weren't some of those people available to answer those questions?
Yeah, and that is a part of the second case file that was created in the 2000s, where Wendi and Jeff Valines, they were the investigators in the 2000s, and they called the original investigators in 1987. And so they asked them about certain things, like, did you take the letter, or was the note in the case file? What was in the case file, since it's not here? Obviously, those original investigators didn't have a lot to say about it, at least according to the notes from Wendi and Jeff, but they were very certain that they had collected the note that was left at the scene. And they also just remembered it as a runaway case.
Stephen, do you know if your parents ever actually went to the guard gate and asked, hey, did somebody call in? Did somebody come in? I was explaining to Bill in our first episode, because Bill isn't based here, but I am. I was explaining about the process for getting into and out of Kings Mill. I have friends who live there. And so I spent a lot of time in my childhood going in and out. And I know that it's very secure, and you have to go to the gate. You have to stop. You have to call in. They give you the pass. Did your parents ever check on who came in and who came out, and if anybody actually came for Jennifer that night?
I don't recall. I'm sure they did, because at the time, the 199 gate at Kings Mill closed at like midnight or 11 o'clock or whatever it was.
Okay.
So it was only the Route 60 gate was the only one open 24 hours in 1987.
Okay, that's good to know.
So in terms of the documentary, one of the questions we wanted to ask was, do you feel that you were able to be specific enough in terms of who you think could be responsible for Jennifer's disappearance? The series closes with things in an open-ended fashion, but do you feel, and we understand there's restrictions, legal and otherwise, about what you can and cannot say in a documentary. Do you feel like you were able to take it as far as you wanted to?
I thought we took it as far as we could take it, based on where the cops were currently with the case and with the information that we were able to gain access to ourselves. It is an active case, and they are pursuing suspects. And if you watch the film, you get a sense of where they're headed. I think for us, when we first started this process, we really didn't think of this as a whodunit with the goal of trying to solve the case. Like, that was not what our intention was when we first started it. When we were initially meeting with Stephen, we thought that this was more of a story about a family tragedy and the fallout of that trauma from 1987. And so that's how we were pursuing the story. But our curiosity about the case and if you watch the series, you'll see this in the very first frames, how the cops ended up suspecting the parents. And so we were very curious about that. And so we brought an investigative reporter, or a former investigative reporter, onto our team to help us. She became an integral part of the team, Andrea Weigel, and she worked at the News and Observer for many years here in North Carolina. And so she became the one that really helped us dissect the case, because Stephen had sued the police department, or was in the process of doing that, to be able to declare Jennifer as being deceased. I think for the legal advice, and Stephen, I'm stepping all over you right now, but for the legal advice that he had received from the attorney that he was working with, he was not able to take action against his parents. And so this was, I guess, one remedy for Stephen to hopefully take some steps at closure, to be able to say, hey, she's always just been listed as missing, but everybody knows that Jennifer's not coming back. So let's go ahead and make the move to declare her deceased. And so because of that work that he had done, he had gained access to that new case file that was created in the 2000s. And this was this big whopping case file that he walked into our house on that first day of shooting or filming. And that's the material that we had to work with. So as the documentary proceeds, you will see the evidence that Stephen pulls out, but that we get to understand how the cops suspected who they did suspect.
Stephen, are you comfortable referring to Jennifer's case as a homicide case, or would you still prefer that people refer to it as missing persons? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about it. I don't believe that my sister's coming back, so I'm fine either way. I've just always thought of her as missing, but what Cynthia said is I didn't sue the police department. When I petitioned the court to have Jennifer declared deceased, I originally made a an information request, like a public information request to the police department for Jennifer's case file to support the petition to have her declared deceased. And then what the police department told my attorney was, look, we can't give you that under this way that you asked for it. But if you subpoena the information, us for that information, we won't fight it. And that's how that's how I received the case file. And then when I had Jennifer declared deceased, my attorney had to go meet with the judge and the police department, and then he declared Jennifer deceased. And that's when I put a marker in the cemetery for her. And it was, at the time, that felt like closure then. So that was why I did it.
I'm still pleasantly surprised they gave you the case file. From personal experience, the FBI has fought us every step of the way. And the FBI is the responsible agency in my sister and Rebecca Dowski's murder.
I think that at the time, it was probably the distinction is that they were treating Jennifer's case as a cold case and not active. And do want to take this opportunity to say that the police department has been great to me all the way back to 2009. They've been really good to me and kind, and they return my phone calls, and they've just been great to work with.
I wish I could say the same.
You have a different, you're wrestling a different beast altogether.
Yeah. People have said to me, Bill, you should sue the FBI. And it's, you do recognize that what that actually looks like is William F. Thomas versus the United States of America. That's actually who I'm suing. Yeah. And when you think about the resources,
they can put their own money.
Yeah, I think they do, as a matter of fact.
Cynthia, I know you said that you didn't set up for it to be a whodunit, but if I had to guess, I would imagine that probably tips have begun to come in either to you or to Stephen or to James City County. Can you speak to that, whether or not tips have come in? Are you getting leads in this case at all?
Go ahead, Cynthia.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, no, I haven't. I've received a couple phone calls that I've referred to the police department. I know I've spoken to Jake. He's told me that he's received some calls. Nothing really specific that he can follow up on, but he has received a few calls.
And one of those calls is from my roommate, actually. So
I
know you did speak to her. Yeah. So,
okay.
Yeah, but I was very curious whether or not this was going to yield any investigative leads. I'm hoping that it does eventually.
Yeah, I hope it does. And I know the police department is hoping that as well.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Let's talk about Jake Rice for a minute. He appears in the documentary. What's his role now as a forensic investigator? Is he still with the James City County Police Department on a full-time basis, or what's his status, if you will?
He's there part-time. He retired as a police officer, but he still works for the police department. He just doesn't carry a badge and a gun. And he and Rich are the principal investigators on the case. Jake has the most history with it, going back to 2000, probably 10-ish. And he knows the most.
And what's your relationship like with Investigator Rice?
Jake is great. That's not to say that we haven't had tense conversations, or at least because we have. He has a process that he has to work through. I have to respect the process. I can't change it. The only thing I can do is try to help him get through it as fast as he can. But Jake has been terrific.
There were definitely times when I was watching and we were watching you make phone calls to Jake, and Jake was saying, there's stuff is still out at the lab. I don't have results for you yet. And again, I had that sense of deja vu. I've seen this before. I've heard this before. I know Bill gets those same phone calls. There's just this real sense of empathy about this whole entire thing with what you're going through is related to what Bill's going through. It's a little startling to realize that seems to be what most people who have a cold case are going through, rather than, I think it's the norm rather than a surprise. And I hate that. I hate that's the norm.
One of the things we talk about on Mind Over Murder is that there are 250,000 cold case homicides in the United States. So there are at least potentially millions of people, if you think about everybody having a few loved ones within their family. There are actually millions of people going through this. It's actually usually a very quiet process. It was a privilege to meet you through the documentary process. And then Kristin and I were watching it at the same time, but not in the same room.
Yeah.
We were both making a point of, hey, let's watch these 4 episodes and compare notes, which some of which we did on the air on our podcast. Because it's usually such a private process, it was unusual to see all of these very strong parallels between your journey and mine. I think I got most heavily involved in Kathy's case in 2009, which I think also roughly parallels the time frame where you decided you wanted to step forward. How did you feel about opening up at least that part of your life over the course of 7+ years?
The big picture was justice for my sister. And so whatever I had to do to help deliver justice for my sister was what I did. Whatever consequence, that's just what I did. And I always kept the big picture, the big goal was justice for my sister. And so I just did whatever was required for that.
Did you ever find yourself circling back with Cynthia as a filmmaker and saying, let's not put that in? Or did you think to yourself, I'm focused on the larger goal and I'm willing to do this, show the process, warts and all?
Yeah, I'll let Cynthia answer that. I don't.
No pressure, Cynthia.
No, the interesting thing, and when Stephen watched the episodes towards the end, he had not seen anything. He walked out and he said, "What did you say again about the trust exercise?"
Oh yeah, this was the ultimate kind of trust fall exercise. Because I didn't see any of it until I guess about a year before it came out. I saw the first couple episodes and we were still waiting on lab results and everything else for the 4th. But yeah, I didn't see any of it for 6.5 years. And this was Cynthia's film, and whatever she wanted to put in it, she could put in it.
Yeah, it's a big responsibility, but it's also an honor to have someone like Stephen trust you like that with all the material that we had and the intimacy, and everyone that we filmed was great about that, I have to say, or mostly I have to say. But it's like that as a documentary filmmaker all the time. It's like that fine line between being there and showing enough so the audience is very clear about the emotional trauma and the struggles. And then when does it become exploitation? When are you exploiting them? And so you have to be mindful of that at all times, I feel like.
Cynthia, I wanted to ask one thing in particular about the reenactments. I noticed you had actors, of course, for Jen, for Margie, and for Ron. Were you there orchestrating everything that was going on with all of the actors and actresses? How long did that take? I'm really curious about that. And Stephen, I'm curious how you felt about watching somebody playing your sister. But let me start with Cynthia. Talk about the reenactments a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, they were very much a part of the whole process of what I was envisioning for the film. And I'd never directed actors before, so I was a bit nervous about that process because it felt very foreign to me. But I really was determined to use those recreation scenes to amplify the unreliableness of memory. That's how it all started, was that we were getting these different takes on Jennifer, like who Jennifer was. So that it started out with that, like everybody had a different Jennifer when they talked about her. And I thought that was so interesting and compelling, and shouldn't be that surprising when you think about a 15-year-old girl. She is going to play a different role for different people. She's going to be different for her mom, her dad, her brother, her friends, her teachers. She will be different and described differently. And that started out this whole idea of trying to amplify that theme again of having memory being unreliable too.
Stephen, how was it for you watching someone playing Jennifer?
So much of this whole experience, not just the film going back to 2009, has been surreal. And that's just one other surreal moment. But the first time, that I met Savannah, it was just super weird. And, that was long before I had seen anything. I think it was at a birthday party for Cynthia that where I first met Savannah.
That's the actress that played Jennifer.
Yeah, that's another experience that you and Bill actually have in common. When Oxygen did a documentary on the Colonial Parkway murders, we also had reenactments. And I remember sitting with Bill in a van right outside of the area where they were doing a reenactment of Kathy's murder and just asking him, are you okay meeting an actress who's playing your sister, essentially? I can't imagine how surreal it is. I think that's a great word, Stephen. This is going to be a very intense and unusual process, but your product is amazing.
One of the things I was very struck by were the use of the real life footage from what essentially are interrogations of Stephen and Jennifer's mother. How did you gain access to them, and how did you feel like you were going to preserve the integrity of the conversation in showing them? Obviously, you're not going to show hours of footage in a documentary that has a limited runtime, Cynthia. How do you work around that?
Copies of the interrogation were on DVDs in that original, that case file that Stephen acquired in 2014. And so that's how we got access to that materials, because it was just part of what was given over. Stephen made this petition. And so when we came across it, or when we watched it, Tom Bickers, who is the editor that I've been working with for many years, he and I have been a team, or all of the work since, I don't know, for 15 years almost. He was like, oh my God, because I was like spot checking stuff because we're out in the field, and you got to sit down and watch it from start to finish. And so sitting down and watching it, and we contemplated for a long time as we're editing, is like, how much do you think that we can show? And it's like, gosh, it would be amazing to have a whole episode of just that material so that you can really get a sense of what that experience is like for someone. And especially after you see the ending of the series, going back and watching that again. And we do visually reference that at the end of episode 4, so that we remind the audience of what emotionally that probably was doing at that time. It was important for us to have as much as we could have in there. But yes, when you are doing something for a large streamer broadcaster like HBO, they are concerned about audiences and making sure that they don't tune away. And so it was a negotiation as to how much we could.
And that was long, because that first interview with my mom took place on a Thursday from around 6 p.m. to midnight. There was 6 hours of it from that day, and then 3 hours of it the following day.
Wow.
And that was a really hard day.
Are you in touch with former investigator Wendi Reed as well?
I talk to Wendi on occasion. I don't talk to her regularly or anything, but yeah, just on rare occasion I do, yeah.
So are the two of you on the same page in terms of your personal theories about the case, about what may have happened to Jennifer? Or is there any place in which the two of you vary about what you think may have happened to her?
I'll answer it by not answering it. That's what I want to do. And obviously, as a filmmaker, and I think Stephen's been on this similar ride with us, we have to imagine what transpired, because that helps us figure out where do we want to go with asking more questions, and who do we think we should talk to, and all that stuff. So, of course, over the course of working on this case or making the film, I've had different ideas floating in my head as to what you think transpired. And it has varied wildly, I have to say. I think that what you'll see is we still don't know, because like trying to put those pieces together with what information we do have now, which is a lot more than what we started with, some of it still doesn't line up. So like, how does that happen? So still trying to make sense of how she got out of the house without anybody knowing is still a mystery. And so it's, I was hoping that we would have more answers. And I think I don't know, Stephen, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's fair. And it's, look, one of the things that led to all this heartache and is speculation, right? So try hard not to repeat that same mistake in the absence of actually knowing.
So well put.
We're not trying to compare our limited experience with anything close to the number of years now that the two of you have dedicated to Jennifer's disappearance. Even Kristin and I have spent hours talking about just that one issue, for example, and lots of others. How did Jennifer get out of the house without anyone noticing? And we went through any number of options, some of which seemed to make sense to us at the time. Even my view of the case, which again is limited based on all the articles we've read, watching the series very carefully, and really being very impressed with the amount of work that you've put in, you still end up with almost as many questions as you have answers. Was that a hard sell, Cynthia, for a documentary? Were you ever under any pressure to push this in a particular direction? Obviously, we don't know what happened to Jennifer, and the series has to end on a question mark.
I think that you, as a filmmaker, could have had a lot of pressure from executives from certain networks or streaming platforms, but working with HBO, they came on board fairly early on for development when we had no idea that the case was going to even become active again. So we never said from the very get-go that this was going to be a case that was going to be solved. So I think that there was never this, oh my gosh, you didn't solve that? Awful. But I do think that as the case became active and we were there in the throes and the thick of the investigation and uncovering things on our own, there was I hate to use the word excitement, but for lack of a better word, about excitement over the potential of learning more. And we do learn a lot more. We don't have the definitive answer, but we do learn a heck of a lot more. And I think that we're closer to understanding more about Jennifer's state of mind and other things that are going on surrounding Jennifer that play into this whole case. And so I felt as though that not having a case that was solved did not hinder the power of the story when it finally did come to an end for us and how we were telling the story.
Would you ever consider returning with a 5th episode if there were significant developments in the case?
Yeah, I would love to be able to do that, to pick it up and hoping that we do have more concrete answers. Yeah.
Stephen, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'm open for it. Well, you just have to wait and see. If telling Jennifer's story helps others, then I'm all for it.
And ultimately, I think for us, it was and Bill, you were hitting on this earlier, like having the access to a family who is in this limbo about a cold case and about a family member and not having the answers and this lingering trauma from all of that and what it does to all the parties at play was really important. And we didn't want that to be lost. And that was what our primary storyline was to begin with. And we always honored that. Even when the case became more active and there's more interest in the clues and stuff like that, for us on our team and also with Stephen, it's still about the process. It's still about the family. And that always was what we made for us important to continue to follow.
And I think that's ultimately what does come out most in our episode where we sat and deconstructed everything. Knowing Jennifer's case and the whereabouts and the whys and the wherefores of it all is great. But what really came across to me, and I kept saying to Bill over and over, is how very much I feel for Stephen, how empathetic I felt about all of this. And part of that is just because nobody should have to go through this. Also, part of it is I've watched Bill go through it. I know it. I just felt an enormous amount of empathy and sympathy, to the point where I couldn't binge it all at once. Normally I would, but I couldn't do it all at once. I had to divide it up over 2 days because it just felt at times, this is so emotional and so wrenching, and that I couldn't manage to do it all at once. If that is your ultimate goal, from my point of view, you achieved it.
I guess last question for both of you is what's next for the two of you?
Oh gosh, for me, it's just about moving forward. Still doing what I can for Jennifer, but moving forward and being at peace, knowing that I've done all I can do. For me, that's all I ever wanted out of all this. In the absence of justice for my sister, and the only thing I wanted was peace.
Cynthia, what's next for you? I know it's probably got to feel a little, I asked you off air, does this feel exciting or does it feel anticlimactic now that you've got it out there, this process of so many years' work?
Yeah.
What are you doing now?
Yes, even I've talked about that a little bit. I feel lost, like unmoored almost. And filmmakers will say this, filmmakers will say that you have to abandon a story, that the story never concludes. It's one of those things where I don't want to feel like we've abandoned this storyline or Jennifer's story. And it's still very much present because I still think that there's things that we haven't told. There are things that are in the back of my brain that keep it alive and wanting to continue with this story. But I need to have work that pays. So I am working on other content, and I was hired by NASCAR to do a series about 9-year-olds that race at a dirt track outside of Charlotte. And that's been very different and really fun. So it's nice to have that balance between more serious material and something that is not. But surprisingly, this has become pretty serious.
I was thinking that was going to have a lighter tone.
Yeah. And the other thing that I've been doing with 2 team members of mine, Blair Johnson, who films with me all the time. She's a cinematographer, and Sandra Davidson, who is a producer. We've been going to the Ozarks filming with Bigfoot hunters. And so that has been a real gift, actually. You get to go camping and off grid. And so it allows me to really disconnect and to think about life in a really different way. And surprisingly, like how a lot of these stories overlap in interesting and unique ways, is that this is a story about the pursuit. It's a story about a journey. And I find myself telling a lot of those kinds of stories.
That is very cool.
I look forward to actual footage of Bigfoot in
the
coming year.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Burden of Proof is available on HBO Max, or I guess we're just calling it Max now. Burden of Proof is available on Max. We do encourage you to stream it. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.